Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you. I thank you for yielding, Madam Speaker, and I thank you for this night that we can get together and talk about something that is on the minds of almost everybody still in the United States, because, quite frankly, even though this bill has passed both houses of Congress and been signed into law by the President, there's just an awful lot of people in this country. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the people in this country are just, every day they wake up to find out there's something else that nobody knew was in this bill, and something else that's imposed upon the states and the people of this country that nobody knew was going to happen. It's because it was a 2,400-page bill or somewhere like that, that nobody ever read, and it was voted on and passed when there was people who were responsible for its contents who couldn't tell you what was in it. In fact, I believe the Speaker of this House made a statement: "We need to pass this bill so we'll learn what's in it." That's kind of when the worrying started in this country, when people started hearing that kind of things from our leadership. And so we are now at a point where there has been a lawsuit, and we talked about this, I believe it was last week or week before last. We talked about the fact that a lawsuit has been filed by the attorney generals of multiple states in this country. Well, this is a growing process. When we last talked, there were 20 states that had joined in this lawsuit. And here we are, as of April the 26th, 2010, we have 22 states. So 2 more states have joined this process. And there's at least the possibility that we could add maybe another 5 or 10 states that will join in this lawsuit. So this, right now, as it stands right now, it's my understanding, and I can be corrected, I do not claim to be a great historical scholar of the Supreme Court of the United States. I've read cases, was required by my profession, and I have taken constitutional law in law school, and I've had great constitutional law debates among my law school colleagues when we were young would-be lawyers, and have had some periphery of the constitutional requirements that are set out by the Supreme Court in my practice of law and as a judge. But I don't claim to be an expert on it, but I'm told that this is probably the largest single group of states to file suit on behalf of their individual states and join together in an issue since the court started. Now, I may be wrong about that, and I certainly will be corrected if somebody wants to correct me, but it's close. And we've got 50 states in this union, and 22 of them are already in this lawsuit. So if we pick up 3 more states, we'll have half the states in the union will be involved in this lawsuit. But even at 22, it's really kind of a mind-boggling number. It also represents 44.56% of the population of the United States. So within these red states that you see on this map here, those dark states, as compared to the light states, if anybody's still watching in black and white, that represents almost half the population of this country, who are asking the question, and the question is very simple. Does the Constitution grant Congress the power to mandate the coverage that's set out in this bill? Now, that's a big question, but it narrows down to a much narrower issue. There's more issues here, but the most narrow issue is, does the Congress have the authority to mandate that a person living within the continental United States must buy a certain product, namely health insurance, from a designated seller of that product, which means some insurance company? That they have to, that they cannot have an option, they cannot say no. And if they say no, that they can be fined under the IRS code and can be required to pay up to a $2,000 fine for not purchasing the health care. And that there's some ranges in that. It can be less. But if it's $1, it's a fine punishing you for not buying a product. Now, the great debate is broadly about the 9th and 10th Amendment, but specifically about the Commerce Clause as set out in the Constitution of the United States. So every Attorney General in every one of the states you see here, and this is a pretty nice cross-section. We've got Eastern Coast, one West Coast, a whole bunch of Southern states, a whole bunch of Western states, a whole bunch of Midwestern states. They're in this fight. And they are asking a real simple question about the Commerce Clause. But here's some stuff, as I said, it's like we wake up every morning and we have new things to talk about this plan. A recent Center for Medicine and Medicare Services has come up with some new findings on this bill. And let's examine these together. I'm glad to have my friend Mr. Burton here who's going to join me, and we'll talk about some of this stuff. 20 million Americans who currently can't afford health insurance will buy a policy under duress from the threat of fines and IRS action. This is what they found. 4 million Americans will still not be able to buy and will be fined $33 billion a year and still not have health insurance. 14 million Americans will lose their employer-sponsored health insurance as a direct result of this new law. 23 million Americans will still have no health insurance coverage in 2019 after the bill is fully implemented. And 21% of the gross domestic product of the United States will be spent on health care after the law is implemented, which is higher than if Congress had done nothing. So if there's nothing would have happened, we spent this much, 21% of the gross domestic product. Can I have a glass of water? So we're sitting here. The first thing we were told is the reason we need to pass health care is we need to get a cheaper product. I mean, we need to save money. We need to reduce the deficit, reduce the debt. Well, we haven't reduced the spending because it's going to be 21% of gross domestic product, which is larger than it is today. And it's estimated it's larger than it would have been if we hadn't done anything. So these are facts that sort of jar you into reality that we've got a product that every American sitting around the coffee shop tomorrow morning ought to be talking about. That everybody in every office building, on every farm and ranch, and every small business in America ought to be asking questions about what has become the new law of the land. And I think the attorneys general of the multiple states in this country, they started asking these questions as the process was going through. And as they discovered nightmare after nightmare after nightmare as pertained to the states, they started getting to be rattled, and they started to say, this can't be. We can't be imposing this kind of will under the Commerce Clause. So I think it's important that we look at the 9th and the 10th Amendment and the Commerce Clause. And I'm going to start off, we're going to argue talks about some constitutional law here with my good friend Dan Burton. We're going to see how we figure this is. So I think I've got a, yeah, here we go. I think everybody out there learned in school, we have a Constitution and we have amendments to that Constitution, which is just part of the Constitution, just came at a different time. And the amendments have a lot to do with individual rights and liberty in this country. And when our founding fathers were looking at this project and what they were doing, they were going from sovereign states. You know, the people of Virginia considered themselves, Virginia was a sovereign state. That meant sovereignty lay in the state. And they were meeting in Philadelphia to see how much sovereignty they would surrender and what they would create in the form of a federal republic. And remember what Benjamin Franklin, when asked out, as he walked out the door, what kind of a government they had created, he said, a republic, if you could keep it. Because it depends upon those who are given that gift to keep that republic. which means it has some basic concepts which our founding fathers were ingenious about creating. And one of them was the balance of power, that there would be offsetting power between the three branches of government, which would balance out the power so no overwhelming power would lie in any one branch of the government. There are three branches: the executive, which is the president and all the various executive agencies of the government, and then the legislative, which is the House and Senate, and then the judiciary, which is the entire judicial system of the United States, capped off by the Supreme Court of the United States. So when they wrote this, they wrote the 9th and the 10th Amendment. And the 9th Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Because our founding fathers took the position, which learned people of that time were debating and putting forth, that the rights that are set out in our Bill of Rights and in the other rights that are defined in our Constitution are first and foremost the rights of the people. Each individual person has those inalienable rights. And so when they sat down and they started to put this thing together, they said, now, any rights we didn't talk about still belong to the people. So just because they didn't write it down in the Constitution doesn't mean there are more rights than rights we always have: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and all the ones you learn in school. There are more rights than that, because those rights lie with the people. Then the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. The Constitution defined the powers of the United States government, nor prohibited to it by the states, so that in other words, aren't specifically set out for the states, or reserved to the states and respectively to the people, or to the people. So what they're basically saying is there are powers out there that this Constitution doesn't cover. Now, I think we all know that the Constitution has been an evolving process, because one of the jobs, the big job of the Supreme Court of the United States is to tell us what things mean when you start applying events to the Constitution. There's a clause in the United States Constitution which is called the Commerce Clause. And it says the U.S. Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Commerce is the big word. And the question is, what is commerce? And I think if you went to a business school and talked about commerce, you'd find out that they're basically talking about the buying and selling and trading and working with goods and services. Be pretty much what you're talking about. The economic activity, buying and selling, so forth. Now, a more liberal court started expanding the Commerce Clause slightly, and the one that really kind of threw everybody off was a case where some folks during the Depression were growing wheat in their own backyard. They were grinding that wheat, and they were making it in bread, and they were eating the bread. And the question was, is that wheat in commerce? And the court said because it was competing with other wheat that was being ground into grain, to flour and made into bread that was being sold, and therefore it was at some point had an effect upon the commerce involving bread and wheat. Even though it was only consumed by the family, they expanded to say that was commerce. And from that, the idea came up, and it was cropped up and was challenged and failed several times in the Supreme Court to be carried that far, was that Commerce Clause, if you take it that far, it'll cover everything. And really, this bill that we're talking about, this one right here that we just got the report on, this bill is going to be the ultimate decision of whether the Commerce Clause means commerce covers everything or not. Because in this bill, the only thing you have to do to be required to buy health insurance by the government is be alive. if you are a human being and breathing, you have to buy health insurance. Or have to have it. If you don't have, if you have it and you get to keep it, then you've got health insurance. But if you don't have it, now it's no option. You have to buy it. Now, the first thing you hear is people say, well, yeah, but you got to have insurance to drive an automobile, and you have to have it. That's true. But that is insurance that is protecting other people from your negligence or your mistakes as you drive your automobile. And it's an issue for the state, protecting the state, because it makes sure that people are able to protect those that they might injure when they use a dangerous weapon. And by the way, it's kind of interesting that the courts have ruled that an automobile can be used to enhance punishment in a criminal case because it is a deadly weapon. So basically, they're insuring against the misuse of the deadly weapon called the automobile. It's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about you've got to have health insurance whether you're sick or whether you're well. You got to have it. And if you don't, you got to pay a fine. And that fine is going to be in the nature of an excess tax. So there's a good place for me to turn and yield such time as Mr. Burton would like to use to talk about how he sees this and what thoughts come to his mind as we look at this really challenging constitutional issue.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to tell him how much I appreciate him coming down and taking the time to take this special order. It took a lot of preparation to explain this to our colleagues and anybody that might be paying attention to this. There's no question in my mind that the 10th Amendment of the Constitution is being violated by the bill that we passed, and that's why we have 22 states that have joined in this suit. And I'm glad that they're doing that. As a matter of fact, on March the 29th, the Attorney General of Indiana, Greg Zeller, expressed his intent of having Indiana join in filing the suit against the, quote, Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which is the Obamacare we're talking about. And here's what he had to say, our Attorney General. He said, there are significant constitutional questions regarding the federal government's authority raised by the legislation passed. I believe it's necessary that these ultimately be brought before the United States Supreme Court. And as the Attorney General of Indiana, I will join in the most appropriate legal actions available to represent the significant interests of our state, the state of Indiana, in this matter. And he prepared a 55-page report on this that he gave to our legislators in Indiana regarding the Patient Protection and Affordability Act. And he believes, as the other attorneys general do, that this is unconstitutional. Now, my colleague just talked about the automobile business and how people have to have car insurance. Well, they don't have to drive a car. And if they don't drive a car, they don't have to have car insurance. This is the first time that I can remember in my life that the federal government is telling people they have to buy something. I've never heard of this, and I've never read anything that would lead me to believe that the federal government has the authority to tell people that they have to buy something. Now, there have been times in the past when the federal government tried to take over the entire commerce of the United States. Back in the 1930s, during the Roosevelt administration, they passed a law called the National Recovery Act. And the National Recovery Act gave the federal government control over the entire economy of the United States regarding commerce. And there was one case that came to mind that I read in a book called The Forgotten Man. I don't know if my colleagues read it or not, but it involved two itinerant people from the Middle East that came to the United States, and they started selling chickens. Back in those days, they didn't have frozen chickens in the supermarket. And so when people would come to them to buy chickens, they had them in crates. And they would let the people that came to buy the chickens reach in and pick the chickens they wanted. Well, the National Recovery Act, which was controlling the commerce of the United States, had individuals, like the IRS is going to have under this bill, that would come out and tell the people what they could and couldn't do. And the National Recovery Act representative came out and told these two gentlemen that they could not let the people pick the chickens that they wanted. I know this sounds crazy. They said because the people that came in and bought the chickens first would pick the fatter ones, and they would get the benefit of being there first. And the fellows that owned this company said, well, this is the way we've always done it. We let the people pick the chickens they want. And so they didn't stop, they didn't change. They continued to conduct their business that way. And they were indicted under the National Recovery Act, and they were convicted. And the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And Justice Brandeis wrote the opinion, which was 9-0 against the National Recovery Act, which went out the window. And Justice Brandeis sent a message back to the president saying, don't send us any more legislation like this, because if you do, we'll find it unconstitutional as well. That was the first time that I know where the federal government started taking over the entire area of the commerce of the United States. But even then, I don't believe there was a time when they said somebody had to buy something which would violate the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, the National Recovery Act was found unconstitutional, but the 10th Amendment, as far as I can remember, never said you have to buy something. And that's what this bill does, and that's why the attorneys general from 22 states are saying you don't have that power. And as you said, Mr. Carter, very clearly, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively. And so what's happening here is the federal government's overstepping its bounds and violating the 10th Amendment and taking away from the states their right to regulate this industry or to deal with whether or not people should or should not have to buy these things. And the attorneys general are saying very clearly this is a state's right, and we don't think the federal government has the right to do this under the Commerce Clause. So I would just like to add a couple other things that go along with this, Mr. Carter, and that is the cost that it's going to be to the American people. The estimated deficit that's going to be created by this, as far as the health care bill is concerned, is about $385 or $395 billion over the next 10 years. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to cost a lot more than that. The estimated cost, according to CBO, based upon the information that was sent to them, was that it was going to cost about $850 or $860 billion over 10 years, and the amount it was going to be, as far as the deficit was concerned, was about $300 and some billion. But the fact of the matter is, they only have 6 years of coverage, but they have 10 years of taxes. And so when you take 10 years of coverage and 10 years of taxes, and you look at what it's going to cost the American people, it's going to run up over $2 trillion, money we don't have. And the deficit already is out of control. The budget we passed this year was $3.85 trillion, or last year. And this year they won't even send us a budget because they know it's going to be more than that. And the shortfall in spending that increased the debt, our debt to our kids and grandkids, was $1.4 trillion last year. It's going to be $1.6 trillion or more this year, and it's going to get worse as the years go by over the next decade or two. And so, in addition to violating the Constitution, as I believe this does, and in addition to having 22 states file suit against the government of the United States because of this bill, this is going to cost an arm and a leg that we don't have. We don't have this money. And who's going to pay for it? Well, we borrowed money from China. We owe them about $800 billion. We borrowed $600 billion from Japan. And if you add it all up, we're probably into the trillions and trillions of dollars that we owe the rest of the world. And if they ever cash in on what we owe them, I don't know how we're going to pay for it. The fact of the matter is, right now, because of the cost of this legislation and the other programs and the deficits that are taking place right now, I really believe that the federal government's going to have to print a lot of money. And when they print money, they inflate the money supply, and we have what's called inflation. And what they try to do is they try to figure out a way to stop that inflation by raising interest rates or increasing taxes. And now the administration is talking about a value-added tax like they have in Europe. And the value-added tax in Europe is running about 20% in many countries. And if you buy a car for $10,000, for instance, and you add the value-added tax to it, you're up to $12,000, another 20%. The American people can't afford it. We can't afford the inflation, we can't afford the taxes, and what it will do to the economy and jobs is unbelievable. not to mention that it violates the Constitution of the United States. So if I were talking to the American people tonight, Mr. Carter, and we can't talk to the American people, we can only talk to each other and the members of the Congress, I would say there's a lot more to this than just a violation of the Constitution. There's no question in my mind that there is that violation. But the cost to us and our kids and our posterity is going to be unbelievable. This country can't afford to spend the money the way we're doing it. We can't afford to raise taxes like they're talking about. We can't afford a value-added tax, and we can't afford to see jobs slip away from America and go offshore to other countries. And that's what I think this is leading to. This administration believes in a European-style socialistic approach to government, and we have to stop that. And the states, I want to pat the attorneys general on the back from those 22 states for leading the charge in dealing with this constitutional abuse of power. And I wish them the very best. And I hope that every state in the union, Mr. Carter, I hope every state in the union will join in this fight, because the federal government should not usurp the rights of the people of this country and the several states. And our forefathers never planned for that. And that's why they gave the states the ultimate power instead of leaving it with the federal government. They said that those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved for the states. And that's the way it ought to be. And I want to thank you once again for taking this special order. You're one of my heroes.
Well, I thank my friend, and regaining my time, let me point out something I think is interesting. With all the flack we sometimes raise when we disagree with some of the rulings of the United States Supreme Court, and I and others that I know have done that throughout my entire lifetime, and we've had great constitutional issues that have banged around everywhere, and some of us have said, what kind of craziness is that? But it's kind of interesting that Justice Brandeis, in that opinion, 9-0, that means everybody thought it was right, pointed out that by the very nature of our Constitution and the very nature of what we created in the way of a republic, this concept of a centrist controlled economy, a central controlled economy, doesn't fit what was founded in this country. We started down that path in the 1930s, and Brandeis and the court slammed on the brakes and put a stop to it. And it was very ridiculous, some of the things they did. There's the famous kosher meat case that went on, and a bunch of other cases, just ridiculous. Can you imagine the federal government going into your local butcher shop and telling your local butcher how he could do things? Is that the world we want? That's a centrist controlled economy. Now, at the same time, the world was experiencing this in other places. And in fact, we've in our lifetime seen the rise and collapse of centrally controlled, central planned economies. The National Socialist Party of Germany in the Second World War, besides losing a war, proved that a centrally controlled economy was an ineffective way of doing an economy without letting the markets work. The Soviet Union collapsed, continuing to try to keep a central controlled economy run by the one big government entity in every fingers in everybody's world. It didn't work. It didn't work. The Chinese had the same thing, and even though they still claim communism, they are rapidly rushing towards capitalism because they are getting rich and prosperous for all levels in their country under the capitalist system, which they never could do with their centrally controlled economy. Why we would even think to go in that direction is beyond me. And I think my colleagues, many of our colleagues think that is the solution to our problems. I do not think so. I think our founding fathers intended for us to have things both at the local, at the city, the state, the national level. I think they had a concept of the small family all the way up to the big government. And they specifically wrote these little used provisions, by the way, into the Constitution to make it clear that there were certain things that didn't belong in the federal government. And I'm very hopeful that that's the way that this court at this time in the 21st century, with all the history that's passed and all the court cases that passed, you're going to look at this and say, if we can tell them they got to buy what kind of health insurance, then what's next? How far will we expand this? Can the next administration, whoever it may be, say you have to buy General Motors cars because we own around 50% of the stock in the American people? Or can it just say, you know, we've got a fledgling industry over here, you can only buy that computer or that pair of socks, but you can't buy those socks. Not until you've got 5 pairs of those socks. And you want the federal government doing that? I don't think anybody in their right mind in this country wants that to happen. But to start, the crack in the dam, the slow drip, is going to be what they have proposed, which is going to be a slow drip that's going to create massive cost to this country. And by the way, my friend Mr. Burton wasn't even talking about the cost to the states. Those are federal costs. They imposed upon the states costs the states didn't have any say in whatsoever.
With the gentleman yield just
Yes.
on that point real quickly, you know, our governor, who I think is one of the best governors in the country, Mitch Daniels, he said that passing this would put 500,000 people more on Medicaid in the state of Indiana. And I just wanted to validate the point that you just made. This is going to be a tremendous burden on states all across this country because they're going to shift an awful lot of the burden that's on the federal health care system to the states. And in Indiana, we're going to be spending billions of dollars more over the long haul because they're going to put 500,000 people more on Medicaid. And I don't know that that's the exception. I think every state in the union is going to suffer like that.
It is.
And that's a hidden cost that we're not even talking about.
We are joined, and reclaiming my time, we're joined by my good friend and colleague, my classmate, and a fellow Texan, Dr. Burgess, who has spent most of his life on these issues, and certainly his time in Congress. Since the day I met him, he has had the best ideas I've heard on health care, but he's been a voice crying in the wilderness. But he does know what we're talking about, and I'll be glad to yield to Dr. Burgess to educate us on what he sees these issues are and where this thing's going.
Well, and I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I must say it's humbling for just a simple country doctor as I to come down here and talk constitutional issues with the great constitutional scholars of our time.
Oh yeah, right.
But you know, Judge, you mentioned something that is so important. So many people are concerned about what they see happening, and I see by one of the posters that you have there that almost 45% of the United States population, or state attorney generals representing almost 45% of the U.S. population now are suing over the constitutionality of these health care mandates. And remember, all of that has happened within a 4-week time span of us passing this very flawed piece of legislation. No, there's no way to know what the next 4 weeks will bring, but certainly as more and more people evaluate this, as more and more people dissect through that very flawed product that was passed by the Senate on Christmas Eve, and then we just, for whatever reason, picked up and agreed to it over here in the House at the end of March, as more and more people look at that and see the drafting errors and see the inconsistencies that are contained within that legislation, I believe that number will in fact become much higher by the time we get to Memorial Day. It will grow in numbers through the month of June, and by the time we get to Independence Day, I've got to believe that number, that there is going to be a startling percentage of the United States population that is now against this bill. The problem with this bill is it never enjoyed popular support. People want to criticize Republicans for being obstructionists in this process, but honestly, they did not need a single Republican vote. They have a 40-vote majority on the Democratic side. This was all an internal argument on the Democratic side with getting this darn thing passed. And as a consequence of not having popular support, they had to coerce, cajole, threaten, and malign members on their own side in order to get the votes necessary to pass this. Now, right after it passed, Judge Carter and I were a part of a press conference, and our Attorney General, Greg Abbott, was one of the one of the first attorneys general to step forward and say, under the Commerce Clause, I don't think you can do this. And he wrote a very powerful letter to our two senators earlier in the year, and I just wanted to quote a couple of paragraphs from this very thoughtful and lengthy letter that Greg Abbott wrote to our senators. He writes, "The individual mandate is constitutionally suspect because it does not fall into any of the normal categories. The mandate provision of H.R. 3590 attempts to regulate a non-activity." Let me just stop for a second. Attempts to regulate a non-activity. Are there any other non-activities we do during the course of the day that we're willing to give over the regulation of those non-activities to the federal government? I think the judge already made the point. Of course there are not. Continuing to quote from the letter, the legislation actually imposes a financial penalty upon Americans who choose not to engage in interstate commerce because they choose not to enter into a contract for health insurance. Quoting further, in other words, the proposed mandate would compel nearly every American to engage in commerce by forcing them to purchase insurance and then use that coerced transaction as the basis for claiming authority under the Commerce Clause. Continuing to quote from Greg Abbott's letter, Congress's own independent nonpartisan research agency, the Congressional Research Service, expressed doubts about the Commerce Clause applicability in a report issued last July. Despite the breadth of powers that have been exercised under the Commerce Clause, it is unclear that the clause would provide a solid constitutional foundation for legislation containing a requirement to have health insurance. It may be argued that the mandate goes beyond the bounds of the Commerce Clause. And then finally, just to conclude from Greg Abbott's letter, if there are to be any limitations on federal government, let me just underscore that any one more time. If there are to be any limitations on the federal government, then commerce cannot be construed to cover every possible human activity under the sun, including mere human existence. The act of doing absolutely nothing does not constitute an act of commerce that Congress is authorized to regulate. A very powerful letter by the Attorney General issued last January to our two senators as the Senate was working through this health care bill. You know, I've been so concerned about this bill that we passed, and I wake up in the middle of the night almost every night wondering what the future holds. And Judge, you're so right. In some ways, you know, you kind of get this mental image of this omniscient central planner, albeit a benign and kind and eloquent central planner, moving data points around on a big spreadsheet somewhere. That's what the administration of healthcare has become in this country. Look at the job we have turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services and the Center for Medicare Medicaid Services, another small federal agency called the Office of Personnel Management, and yes, for crying out loud, the IRS involved in regulating healthcare. These federal agencies are now tasked with writing the rules and regulations out of this 2,700-page behemoth that, again, passed the Senate on Christmas Eve as a vehicle to allow the senators to get out of town ahead of a snowstorm. No one read that darn thing. No one knew what was in that darn thing. They just passed it so they could get out of town. They always intended to come back and make it better in conference or some other secret coordinated meeting with the White House where they would come up with an amalgamated product. But they didn't do it. They didn't follow through. They just picked up this Senate bill. A lot of people don't understand. The Senate bill actually has a House number. It's H.R. 3590. Now, why would a bill passed by the Senate dealing with health care have a House number? Well, because it began as a House bill. It began over here, the end of last summer, as a bill to regulate housing. Charlie Rangel introduced it from the Committee on Ways and Means. It passed the House. I voted against it for the record when it was a housing bill. It went over to the Senate and lay fallow for a period of time until the majority leader in the other body decided that they needed a vehicle for this health care reform. They decided not to affix a Senate number to it. The House had passed a bill. They chose not to pick up our House bill that dealt with health care. They picked up our housing bill and amended it. One of the first amendments was to take all the language out of it. So now they have an empty bill, a number, and literally nothing else. They stuck in that all of these little special deals that they had to strike, and the question wasn't, what is the best possible health care policy that we could come up with? In fact, if that question had been asked, maybe they would have looked at Governor Daniels' use of consumer-directed health plans in his state and how he's held down costs. But they didn't do that. They said, what will it take to get your vote? And whatever that answer was the piece that was inserted in that bill. That's why you've got an amalgam of so many disconnected pieces in this 2,700-page monstrosity that is now H.R. 3590. Once that thing passed to get them out of town on Christmas Eve, and it was literally a Christmas tree that night when they passed it, but once they passed that bill, they all expected to come back to a conference committee or some other vehicle to amend and improve this bill. But when the senator from Massachusetts was elected as a Republican, it threw a big kink in their plans. They decided the only way to get, and remember, the goal here was not to fix problems that are besetting the American people in our healthcare system. The goal was to get a bill to sign. The goal was a signing ceremony in the East Wing of the White House. The goal was the president to sign a bill during his first term. It's almost like they didn't care what was in it. They didn't care what the health care policy was. It can be as bad as you can possibly imagine. The drafting errors can be rampant throughout the entire bill, but we got a signing ceremony, by golly, and no other president of the United States has ever had that achievement before. And now the rest of us are left with this travesty that's called a health care bill. Doctors and nurses and hospitals, and indeed even insurance companies, and of course regular American patients are going to have to deal with this for the next several generations. We have to rip this thing out root and branch. One of the ways to do that is for the attorneys general to proceed with their lawsuit and be successful in their lawsuit, which is why I so appreciate the gentleman coming to the floor of the House, making the American people aware of what is going on, why the attorneys general are pursuing this, and maybe we will get some relief for the American people, and then we can go back and do the things they were asking us to do in the first place. Fix the problems, not destroy the system. I'll yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
And I thank the gentleman for a great description of one of the reasons when they say you don't want to watch people make sausage or legislation is because no telling what goes in it. And that description of the House bill being gutted of language and changed to a health care bill, I think that's going to be a real eye-opener to the civics classes around the country as to how that thing functioned. And you know, that's part of the nervousness that we're seeing in the American people, and they're concerned about what's going on up here. That kind of overwhelming power play it's contrary to the old fair play that's deep down inside what makes Americans great. So I appreciate you describing that. I see Mr. Burton has risen again.
I just wanted to
I'll yield to him.
I thank my colleague from Texas for yielding. I just want to follow up on what my other colleague from Texas just said. He was quoting the Attorney General of Texas, Mr. Greg Abbott. And there was one clause in his letter that I thought was bared repeating. He said, if there are to be any limitations on the federal government, then commerce cannot be construed to cover every possible human activity under the sun, including mere human existence. The act of doing absolutely nothing does not constitute an act of commerce that Congress is authorized to regulate. And this parallels what we were talking about earlier with the National Recovery Act, because it was designed to cover everything back in the 1930s, and we talked about a couple of examples. And this Attorney General is quoting pretty much what Justice Brandeis was talking about when he wrote the opinion, the 9-0 opinion that destroyed the National Recovery Act, saying that the federal government didn't have the right to run everything. And I think that's exactly what your Attorney General is talking about. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
And you can use your, as he was reading from General Abbott's letter, very well written letter, and he mentioned that particular thought. My thought was you can let your imagination run wild if we are opening the Commerce Clause to existing. If existing puts you in commerce, then I think the sky's the limit. And more so, the sky's the horror. Because ultimately, it can be such an abusive power, and I'm not pointing a finger at any administration, but there could be an administration down the road that imposes where you can live, or one that is really interesting because there are actually countries in this world that do this, and as we were talking about it, it popped into my head, in some European countries, Western European countries. And you know, there's a misconception I think my colleagues know this, but if not, I want to at least put my 2 cents worth in, a misconception that everybody has the same freedoms we've got. Wrong. Just because they got TV shows that we like or something like that doesn't mean they've got the same kind of free society we have. The British system has the right of habeas corpus, but there's plenty of countries that don't have the right of habeas corpus. There's plenty of other rights. But it's kind of interesting, in European countries after the war, they wanted people to vote, so they made it mandatory. The government made it mandatory that you vote. And if you don't vote, it's just like our health care bill. You get fined. Now, they don't have a Constitution of the United States that limits the power of their government. I'm not saying it's all bad, but to me, if I was a guy that didn't want to vote, guy says, okay, pay $50, you got to vote. And then what's the next step? Pay $50 or you got to vote for my party or for my leader. And where's it stop? Things that are done in good conscience, when you open up the power of the federal government, like this interpretation of the Commerce Clause, you can use your imagination and your knowledge of history to see how it could become, at some future time, more and more and more depriving of the liberties that we enjoy. So this is about a whole lot of stuff, and it's a whole lot of stuff that upsets you. On the issue of Medicare, I think Texas is at $8 billion, isn't that right? I heard that was what.
If the gentleman will yield,
Yeah.
Several of the state senators have written to me, and in fact I believe I'm quoting Governor Perry correctly, in that it would be a $23 billion cost over the 10-year, covering five. We do our budget for a 2-year time period, so the next 5 budgets. Now, as the gentleman knows, Texas has not been hit quite as hard as some other states by the recession, but it's still been hit. And in the next election, the people who are elected for the next state legislature, the next state senate, are going to have to deal with a budget that is going to, or budgetary environment that is going to be a great deal tighter than any that have any since probably 2002 or 2003. As a consequence, Governor Perry has tasked all of the various interim Senate committees and House committees to look for 5% of savings across the board in the state budget. So they are serious about getting their budget into balance. Of course, by law, they have to do this, and they are looking for every state agency to cut its budget by 5%. That's significant when at the same time the federal government is now saying, because of the increase in Medicare enrollment that you're going to be required to take, the budgetary expansion brought about by this health care bill will be $23 billion over the next 10 years, at a time when every other state agency is being constricted. So are we saying that the federally mandated health insurance is more important than education of Texas children? Apparently we are. Are we saying that the federally mandated health care entitlement is now more important than state transportation issues or state security issues? Apparently we are. But I know this is a serious problem that is being faced by the state legislators and the state senators, and I have heard from several of them over these past several weeks and the weeks leading up to the passage of this bill. And I know, of course, the governor has been quite outspoken about the fact that they are going to have to cut their budget at the state level, and I believe every state agency has been asked to come up with 5%, a nickel in savings out of every dollar that is spent at the state level. It's actually not a bad idea for us if we were to actually do a budget this year, which I'm not sure we are. For whatever reason, Democratic leadership does not seem to think that's important, even though this country is in financial crisis. But squeezing 5 cents of savings out of every dollar is certainly something most Americans understand that run their own business. I certainly had, during times when I ran my medical practice, I would be faced with budgetary shortfalls, and I understood the concept of saving a penny or two or 3 or 4 or 5 out of every dollar you spent. But and the governor has wisely asked his state agencies to do that. We don't seem to be quite so knowledgeable here at the federal level sometimes. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding back. And let me say this: I think it's very interesting because Governor Perry's saying we got to cut 5%. I say hoorah for that. I think that's the right way to go about it. But this bill tells us we've got to set up somebody in our state has to help administer this bill. And ultimately, we got to come up with these pools, regional pools. We create We are pressuring our states to make this thing work. And our states say we don't want that thing. And we certainly don't want the expense of doing it at the expense of our taxpayers' dollars, because we're trying to tighten our budget. You're right. We are lucky in Texas, fortunate, that the economy hasn't hit us as hard. In fact, in my district, in recent times, probably the hardest hit we received from this chamber right here and the one across the way, when the president signed the nationalization of student loans and wiped out 500 jobs in Killeen, Texas. 500 jobs in Killeen, Texas is a lot of jobs. 500 jobs in Central Texas is a lot of jobs. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what ill-conceived ideas can do. This one here is a constitutional challenge to our federal government and our Supreme Court. I have great confidence that they will accept that challenge, and I am hopeful that they will say you can't expand Commerce Clause to breathe it. It just doesn't go that far. You aren't in commerce because you exist. And if it is, then I would argue there are no controls on the federal government's ability to do things to impose burdens upon your life. And I think that's the real underlying issue here, and it's of great importance. But even more so than that is when we came up with the concept of Medicaid, and Congressman Burgess, he worked under Medicaid as a doctor. He knows what it is. But Medicaid is a contract between the individual states and the federal government to come up with a solution for poor people's health care. It was designed for the poor, the underprivileged. And it was designed that the states and the federal government would have the ability to work with the states to put together a contract, and the state would provide so much resources and administer the program, and the federal government would provide so much resources. This bill, without any input whatsoever, not only from no input from the Republicans in the House of Representatives, but no input from the states, they got their contract renegotiated by the federal government without their say. And now they've got this huge financial and bureaucratic burden that's being placed upon the states by the fact that part of the way they were able to get this solution to all the folks that were not covered by health care was to take a big chunk of people and just stick them in Medicaid. And then say, oh, by the way, states, we've decided this is what you're going to do, and you're going to do it. We'll pay our share, maybe, but you got to pay yours, and you got to administer the program. And I think that some of the states, and I know in the Florida case, they are raising that issue. They're saying, can you impose this upon the states at this level? I don't know. The main issue is the Commerce Clause, but that's also that imposition of burdens not anticipated when the deal was struck. I think that's an important part of everything we're talking about here. You know, there are people who say, oh, that Carter and that bunch, a bunch of right-wing nuts down there on the floor, they're all upset about this. They call them socialists and all this stuff. Yeah, but did you look at this map? Did you look at this map? I wouldn't call several areas of this country that's marked in red as bastions of conservatism by any stretch of the imagination. Not that they don't have the right to be the state that they are. And I'm not criticizing them for their beliefs, but this is not some right-wing conspiracy out of Central Texas. Okay? This is a cross-section of the country. East Coast, represented by Washington State, certainly a progressive state, proud to be a progressive state on the West Coast. We got Pennsylvania over here in the east. We got Michigan in the Midwest. You know, this area up here is the heart and soul of the declining auto industry with all their terrible problems. And everybody at night ought to say a prayer for people from Michigan right now, because they're having the hardest time of anybody in this union right now. And we need to correct that as best we can. But more than that, I would at least submit that the Washington Post is certainly not something that Rush Limbaugh and the boys read, consider their newspaper. But let's see what the Washington Post said on March 21st. The individual mandate extends the Commerce Clause's power beyond economic activity to economic inactivity. That is unprecedented. While Congress has used its taxing power to fund Social Security and Medicare, never before has it used its commerce power to mandate that an individual person engage in an economic transaction with a private company. Regulating the automobile industry by paying cash for clunkers is one thing. Making everyone buy a Chevy is quite another. That's from the Washington Post, and I would argue, and I don't think they would argue with me, it's a liberal newspaper. But this is not a liberal conservative fight. This is about freedom and liberty and the structure of our Constitution. Mr. Burgess, I yield to you what time you wish to consume.
Well, I was going to agree with the gentleman that the Washington Post is not likely to be found in the Rush Limbaugh stack of stuff that he uses on his radio program every day. But the freedom argument is one that is so important. Under the Medicaid provisions, as I understand and read the bill that was passed by this House, individuals that earn at or below 133% of the federal poverty level, if they are not covered by any other insurance, since they're going to be required to have insurance, will in fact be required to have Medicaid. They will not be allowed to purchase insurance in the exchange, as other Americans will. They will just simply be placed into the Medicaid program. That too is unprecedented in any of the social entitlements that we've had in the past. Never have we required someone by virtue of their income level that they have to be within a certain federal aid program. The implications of that are startling and may well go far beyond the boundaries of where they exist today. With the passage of this law, it may be a much more startling recession or receding of freedom than we've seen in this country, and really it would just be unprecedented. The loss of freedom will accompany this bill. So I thank the gentleman for bringing up that point, and I know time is short. I'll yield back to the gentleman, but that is an extremely important point that he just made.
Thank you. Recapturing my time. Look here, 23 million Americans will still have no health coverage in 2019 after this bill is fully implemented. So with all the big imposition on the privacy of American citizens and the big imposition by government of mandating them that they have to buy a product, and if they do everything they're supposed to do, and if the states can find the money to run that Medicaid problem, and if they can get the various agencies up and functioning and somewhere find the money to pay the salaries to run them, and if we can create this bigger giant bureaucracy, we'll still have 23 million Americans that won't have health care coverage. If your goal was to cover everybody, you failed. I don't think it's really the goal to cover everybody. I think the goal is to put control of another part of the American economy and Americans' lives in the hands of the federal government. That's what I think this is about. And that's what I think it's always been about since we started this discussion. And that's why the American people were telling us what we want to talk about is cost. This stuff costs too much. What can you do to get the cost down? There's no cost savings in any of this. There's only cost imposition in every bit of this. So the one thing I think that we have a great shortage of in this town, with present company accepted, is common sense. But I have a great confidence in the common sense of the American, the average American, in fact, of every American, whether he be the Wall Street fat cat or the guy that's working in the H-E-B that I shop with every week, which is a grocery store in Round Rock, Texas. They have common sense to know what's good for them and what's not good for them. And I think that's why we're seeing people getting up off the couch and making their voices heard, because this doesn't make common sense. This is not the kind of world we signed on to. It's not the kind of world we fought wars for. So we have an issue that it seems to grow in intensity as the weeks go by. It's almost the gift that keeps on giving, in that there's just more to talk about every week. And it's also more to, like Congressman Burgess, I too have awake in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep because I'm thinking about what's headed down the road and what direction it's coming from and what we have to do. For everybody to know, and my colleagues, many of them don't believe this, but I understand we're about to have a report come out on this. As just an aside, all the members of Congress and all of their office staffs were on page 157 of this bill taken out of this of their health care program and put under the pools. What is it called? Pooling?
The state exchange.
Yeah. But that doesn't exist. It's a very interesting challenge. Time has expired?
Time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Under the Speaker.